I'd like to welcome all of you to our final lecture event this semester, the fall semester 2021. And I'd like to begin by thanking, as usual, my graduate assistant, Shahzad, and also Namrata Jain, who's also been giving her a hand. Thank you for putting this together, making all the logistical arrangements. And I also want to thank the History Department for giving us their support. I'm delighted to welcome Suchitra Vijayan back to Tufts. She was here not so long ago at a conference on Kashmir. Suchitra is a remarkable woman wears many different hats simultaneously, which is not easy to do. She's a barrister at law, a human rights activist, a photographer, a political essayist, a lecturer, and most recently, the author of A People's History of India. She's the founder and executive director of the Polis Project, which is really very interesting. And I wonder whether there is some interface there with her own work that she's put together in this work, which aims at bringing together research, reportage, and resistance in one frame, which I think is quite a bold and excellent, and then the results are excellent. She's published in leading newspapers like the Washington Post, the Telegraph, written for foreign policy, on many issues like conflict, human rights, and has been quoted on various forums such as the BBC, also The Guardian, NBC News, NPR, etc. She's also worked for the UN, a war crimes tribunal for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and is the co-founder and legal director of Resettlement Legal Aid Project in Cairo that gave legal aid to Iraqi refugees. Today, she's going to be speaking to us about her recently published book, Midnight's Borders, A People's History of India, which foregrounds the voices of those forcibly silenced by the everyday violence that underpins the structures of the post-colonial Indian state. Accessibly written and riveting in large part, it's a must read, I think, and I'm sure you'll all agree after you hear her today that she deserves a read. It's a very, very accessible read. So please join me in warmly welcoming Suchitra to Tufts. Suchitra.
Thank you. Professor Jalal, thank you so much for hosting this talk, for having me, and also chairing this session. I'm humbled and honored. Of course, your work has been the starting point for many of us in South Asia as writers, thinkers, and scholars. And in some ways, I think we all borrow from you, because I think you're one of the first in the long line of remarkable women who made it clear that scholarship can be exciting. It doesn't have to be exiled to ivory towers. So in that spirit, thank you so much. And as you said, the Kashmir chapter of the book was actually first presented in its earliest, very raw form at the conference that you organized many years ago, I think 2017, the Kashmir conference. It was also, I think, the only conference that only had all female panelists. It was also a panel, it was also an event that started many important friendships for me. So I am incredibly grateful for all of that. So what I thought I would do today is give an introduction to the book, how it all started. I have images from the book, but also the ways in which the images and stories that didn't make the book is also an important part, is an important part of where we are at this moment, especially with what's happening in India. What I'm going to do very quickly is also share my screen as a way to to present this talk. As you can see, the book has two covers. Of course, one is the cover for the US and one in India. The reason I put these two covers is not just to tell you that there are two versions of it, but it's also because these two very different versions of the book, especially with the India book, what we had to do was we not only had to do the regular edit, the fact check, we had to do a legal audit, which meant that for the India part of it, the book came back with a legal edit, wherein the lawyers go through the manuscript and they send it back with things like sedition, possible treason, could be causing communal disharmony. As a first-time writer, seeing those edits broke my heart because these, for example, there's a sentence in the book that says, the Border Security Force is an opaque organization. And the feedback that I got in the legal edit said, oh, somebody from a retired border security officer association could file a charge against you because this is defamation. And every time I would go back and say, what do we do to fight these charges of sedition, treason, creating communal disharmony? The only thing that I was told was that show more citations. The book already had many citations, and yet to write this book, where does one give citations? How does one cite a sentence that says the BSF is a bureaucratic organization? But more importantly, how does one give citations to the lived experiences of those who live across South Asia, whose histories, whose memories, sometimes even the way they think, they speak, act, their food, all have been over years co-opted, erased, or just violently silenced. So in that sense, we also had to do other things about the book. For example, some of the images that appear in the US-UK version of the book don't appear in the India version of the book. And that happened because we weren't sure if it was safe enough anymore. It was no longer safe to have an image of this person in the book where we had their name, where they lived, and now a photograph. And then we worried that a page, a photograph, could become the identifying marker. What if this became the reason why somebody else was disappeared? And this was not a wild claim. This was not an exaggeration, because the book itself has stories of people who had disappeared because they were found, because the Indian soldiers found a photograph, and all the boys in that set photograph were picked up and disappeared because all of them had, in the Indian administered Kashmir, were wearing a Pakistani cricket jersey. So these concerns and fears were not something that was alien, but we really wanted to put this together. And that also tells you where we are in terms of writing in India. The once largest secular democracy is also now one of the most dangerous places, not only for journalists, writers, but also for anyone who just tends to disagree with what's happening. So with that introduction, I also wanted to start with this. The book begins with this page. It's one of the first and the earliest conversations that I had. The book has a very interesting pre-story and a prehistory. The book didn't start as a book about India. The book started as something else. I was a graduate student at Yale, and I wanted to understand. Initially, I went to Afghanistan because I wanted to write about the US occupation of Afghanistan, what it meant for us to think about 9/11. I was somebody who grew up in the shadows of 9/11. I saw many of my own friends go through what it meant to live through the shadows of the years of war on terror, the shadow that still continues to loom large. But when I went to Afghanistan, I went there because I really wanted to understand what had happened. I also went there with incomplete questions, insufficient questions. Initially, I went there to write about the US insurgency, US insurgency operations that were happening in the border regions. And I had, as I said, I had a very insufficient, almost a childlike question where I said, why had the world's largest territorial army occupying Afghanistan not accomplished its mission almost 10 years later? So when I went to Afghanistan, this was 2010. But once I got there, it became very clear very early on that the questions I went there with were not the questions that were right. What I was seeing was much larger. What I was witnessing was much larger. It was definitely something that was very different from the images, the stories, even scholarly work that was coming out of Afghanistan. And that's how this idea of the border, these borderlands began. I'm not a scholar, I'm not a historian of borderlands, I'm not an anthropologist. And yet, being there, it became very clear that something was happening and I really had to understand what was happening. And I tried my best to put all the skills that I had, which was the skill of being a lawyer, of being a researcher, of being a photographer. And all I did was sit and listen to people. And it quickly became clear that perhaps the stories that we had to look were not the stories in Kabul, but perhaps the stories in the borderlands. And then I spent the next year traveling along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. And when I ended the travel, I came back home. And I think I was having a conversation with a friend and I said, what would I find if I did something very similar with India's borders? What would I find? I initially thought this would be a photography project, but of course, it took me almost 8 years to finish this project. And again, the idea was, I didn't quite know what I was getting into or what is it that I was going to expect. What started as a whim then became something else and completely changed the way that I thought about the subcontinent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read parts of the book that explains many of this, and then also kind of go through some of the images that are in the book. Where you are born, what passport you hold can shrink your world, cripple you, and sometimes kill you. Whether it was the testimonies I've heard from Rwanda and Bosnia, or the stories Iraqi, Somali, Sudanese, and Eritrean clients told me as I prepared their legal petition, what became clear was this: political borders were unraveling across the world. We were living in an age of the great crisis of citizenship and belonging. Had we reached an impasse about how we think about citizenship, borders, and nations enclosed by them? What function does a nation still perform if it has consistently failed to offer the most basic human dignities to its people? I think this question is a question that in some ways drives the entire book. What function does a nation state still perform if it has consistently failed to offer the most basic of human dignities to its people? I'm not talking about human rights. I'm not talking about civil liberties. I'm talking about human dignities, which I think is much larger and far more important for us to think about. And I think once we say human dignity, and I think the framework itself expands itself, and I think it really puts into question not only the way we live right now, but what it means for us to think about the future of how our communities should live. Various democracies are crumbling within these nation states. Could we, I wondered, envision a new world radically remade by freedom and justice? While I struggled with these questions for years, it was in Afghanistan while researching the counterinsurgency practices along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border that the ideas, stories, arguments, and images I had gathered over the years came together as a plan to explore these questions in my home country of India. The idea of traveling along India's borders, all 9,000 miles of it, was audacious. No one had done it before. I didn't know what such a journey would entail. Having conceived of this undertaking, I became obsessed with it. The idea consumed me. I spent the next 6 months reading everything I could. The bibliography I kept at the time lists 113 books and another 150 essays. But even those 6 months of research, saving money, and plotting did not prepare me for the task ahead. The project I thought I would take a mere months took me over 7 years. It would have been easier to pick 10 places on the border, parachute in and describe them and leave. That would have been the most efficient, but not the most truthful. From the farthest outposts of India to ungoverned spaces and forgotten regions, I traveled to places shaped by an array of competing histories. The physical journey opened strange doors, and the days spent waiting for permits at borders, rummaging through archives, and speaking with people in their homes became an integral part of the story. Returning regularly for over 7 years, I amassed endless notebooks, over 1,000 images, and more than 300 notebooks, 300 hours of recorded conversations. How does one assemble these fragments into a book? The book changed in multiple ways as I traveled, wrote, rewrote, edited, added, and discarded material. The guide I can offer to my reader is this: view it as a scrapbook assembled together as an archive of personal, social, the political, told through images, texts, lists, other people's poetry, and maps. Here you will encounter my images as impression, a slice of memory placed in the present. Some chapters are image-rich, and others you will find an absence of visuals. In some chapters, the characters are sturdily situated in their place. In others, they're just fleeting glimpses. The book traces my travel along India's border through a series of stories, encounters, and vignettes over a period of 7 years. The travel follows a route not easily mapped, just like the meandering, shifting, and difficult to trace borders of the subcontinent. So the other thing about the book is that what you see is a fraction of the entire 7 years of journey, research, archival work. And the reason is that it was not only because of the difficulty of telling the story, it's also because as the book was about to go to print. In November 2019 was when the manuscript was due to my publishers. And surprisingly, just a few months before, so much happened. We had the Ayodhya judgment, the National Register of Citizens, the citizenship laws in India happened. Of course, the revocation of Article 370 happened. And I felt that 7 years of work, the entire structure of the book just fell apart. It's as if in those few months, the entire history of the region had been written, rewritten, and many of the people in the book no longer wanted to be a part of the book. And one of the ways in which I had started writing this book was not as a journalist, not as a researcher, but as someone who was putting together a notebook, fragments from people. And the people who are in this book were also collaborators in this book, which meant that every time I would come back, I would transcribe interviews and I would write chapters, I would send it back to them. If people didn't understand or read English, then I would get somebody, the local person who was my contact, to then read it out to them. I wanted to be sure that what I was writing was indeed what people told me. I didn't want to speak for them. I didn't want to misrepresent them. I also didn't want to do the mental gymnastics of taking their words and twisting it into something else. That's why the book, you would see large quotes of people. They're quoted as they speak, translated into English, but also before the transcript went back to them, it was retranslated back to them in their own languages so that they knew that what was going out. So when you write a book in this manner, and when the people who were generous with their time and gracious in so many ways and enabled you to write the book, no longer wanted you to be a part of the book, then how does then one put the book together? So we let many of the stories go. For instance, this book doesn't have a Gujarat chapter. It's not because I didn't travel the Gujarat part of the border. It's simply that the people who are part of the story, almost every one of them no longer wanted to be a part of this book. So that chapter was it's been tucked away. Because I also don't see myself as someone who's a storyteller or someone who's bearing witness, which meant that if people no longer wanted their stories to be told, then it was not my jurisdiction to make those decisions for them. Giving them the agency to also not tell their stories was just as important. So putting this book together was also an exercise in different kinds of mental gymnastics because it's hard to put a book like this together. The second question was, how does one write about India? Because it's incredibly hard to write about India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka as these large nation states. So much has been written, repeated, and recycled about the making of modern India, her diversity, her poverty, her heaving masses, her million gods, her incomprehensible people. In India today, I see an young nation ambushed halfway to freedom. Yet, what we call India, the modern nation state, is a geopolitical myth. Before the British arrived, India, the nation, did not exist. This was also one of the most contentious sentences in the book because one of my editors was very convinced that this sentence itself would get me into trouble because so much of rewriting of history was already happening in India. But also the question goes back, also the question that I was consistently preoccupied with was, how do we narrate stories of resistance as the people's history of a nation, but not controlled by the nation state? Of course, partition holds an important key to so much of the borders and borderlands in South Asia. But again, how does one write about the partition in a way that centers the people who have always been farthest away from institutions of power? So despite these upheavals in 1947, as late as 1946, the idea of partitioning the subcontinent as a solution to the transfer of colonial power to self-rule was unthinkable. For many who survived the partition, whom I spoke to, the idea still seemed unbelievable. People feared the violence, but the thought of a dismembered British India was almost absurd. Many left their homes expecting to return once the violence stopped. Yet the partition forever altered the political and cultural landscape of South Asia. In the intermediate In the intermediate aftermath, 17.9 million people migrated across the subcontinent. Muslims on the Indian side of the new borders, Hindus, Sindhis, Sikhs caught on the Pakistani side, fled their ancestral homes. 91-year-old Balwinder Kaur, whose family had migrated from the newly created Pakistan to India, and who now lives in Toronto, told me, "It took me years to even accept that India had been cut up. No one would believe this had happened to us. Disbelief soon turned into silence. So much history is lost. Maybe if we had told our story of how our generation had suffered because of hate, we wouldn't see this new kind of hate spreading in the country." Nevertheless, when the British finally withdrew, the subcontinent was butchered into twin nations, the Hindu majority India and the Muslim majority Pakistan. Freedom had finally arrived, killing the dream of an undivided India. So one of the other things the book's preoccupation is with is how do we think about freedom outside the ideas of territorial sovereignty? Can we think about freedom outside the ideas of territorial sovereignty? This, of course, is not a brand new idea. This is an idea that colonial intellectuals across South Asia, East Africa, and all colonized nations before have been thinking about. On August 14, 1947, Pakistan became free and India declared independence a day later. The old archival newsreels show India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru addressing his people. We all know the long Tryst with Destiny speech, and he says, "The stroke of midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom." Nehru's speech embodied the grand ambition of a young India painted a picture of a nation made of men and women equally protected by law. 300 million people who had been considered less than subjects by the British rule, divided for years by religion, language, class, caste, would all be united under her one book, her revolutionary constitution given to her by Baba Saheb Ambedkar, independent India's first law minister and the chairman of the drafting committee. While Ambedkar's constitution is seen as revolutionary, the very revolutionary constitution itself then becomes the tool that goes on to inflict immense violence through laws like ASFA, through the PSA, in places like Punjab, Kashmir, the Northeast, places like Manipur, Assam, Nagaland. So what is revolutionary for some also becomes the same book that becomes the act of violence that oppresses the other, also denies them consistently the freedoms that they ask for. And this is also something that is inherent in this book. Not everybody sees the Indian Constitution as revolutionary. They view these constitutions differently, just as they view the maps that India claims to be sacrosanct. While Nehru was still declaring victory, the slaughter had begun. Not everyone rejoiced in these new freedoms. Not everyone lived to see its promises. An estimated number killed between March 1947 and January 1948 ranges between 180,000 to 1 million. There were 3.4 million missing members of targeted minorities in the 1951 census. Every grotesque atrocity imaginable happened here. When the Great Migration came to an end and the killing ebbed, 2 million people had been murdered. So in some ways, violence itself is very, very foundational to this republic. And that kind of violence, the physical violence, also kind of mutates into institutional violence, bureaucratic violence, and that violence is consistently inherited and passed on. So starting from this point of rupture, this book tells some of their stories, long forgotten and erased, to interrogate the nature of contemporary borders. The people whose stories I've documented lived through displacement, economic migration, political exile, ecocide, and in some cases, extreme brutality and violence. Others have lost their homes forever without physically moving. And I think another part that really moved me, and I think also set the tone for this book, is that one of the first conversations I ever did was in the India-Bangladesh border. And the book starts in the prologue with one of the quotes from someone that I interviewed. And they say, when someone asks my name, When someone asks me for my name, I say I'm someone who's lost my home many times over. And the loss of home is something that again repeats over and over again in Punjab, in Kashmir, now with Assam. So once you've lost your home, it's not that that violence stops. You keep losing your homes over and over again. If the story of human civilization is about creation and destruction of various walls, boundaries, and frontiers and fences, what story does a present map of the world tell us? Again, while the story is about South Asian borders, the book also urges people to think about the idea of borders and fences and walls around the world. In elementary school in Madras, as homework, we were told to trace the outline of India many times over to memorize it. The phrase Kashmir to Kanyakumari, arbitrarily connecting the northern frontier to the southernmost tip of India, was used to signify the vastness of the country, the unity of its people. When I started traveling in 2013, it seemed easy to trace the border and write about it. I started with Calcutta as my base, and I got permission, travel permits to and visas to Bangladesh. I briefly headed to Sundarbans to the south before making the journey up to Sikkim, and then to India's northeastern states, first Arunachal Pradesh, and then curving down to Nagaland. But in 2014, my visit to Kashmir complicated matters. Unlike the southern Bengal border, it was impossible to trace the fraught LOC or wander from one point to another. The militarization, the butchered geographies, the minefields, the barbed wires, and the bunkers made it impossible to travel along the line on the map. I had to prepare weeks in advance and make calls and fix appointments. I could travel a few hundred miles, crossing checkpoints after checkpoints, and still not connect with the person I was hoping to meet or arrive at the place I had hoped to see. Kashmir was also where my grammar of descent found political and moral clarity. In Kashmir, I stayed in the largest city, Srinagar, and made multiple trips to the border villages and hamlets, Uri, Bandipora, Keren, Mundia, and Patan, and back. I would leave Srinagar, head to a border village, stay in the homes of those I trusted, travel shorter distances, and return. The overreaching surveillance in these spaces meant I couldn't stay long. I had to move quickly and constantly. In some of these villages, within hours of arriving, the local police would be on alert. In some places like Uri, I was quickly summoned to meet the local inspector. And another thing that I also experienced is that when I started traveling initially, the travel itself was much easier. But towards the end, 2018-19 was the last leg of the travel, things just became very different. I could feel how different it was to travel. In those years when I started, 2012-13, the years that I finished this traveling and writing for this book, 2019, India itself had changed. As a woman traveling, I could feel a certain sense of difference. The other day, somebody was asking me if somebody could recreate these steps. And I said, I don't think I could now recreate the very steps that I took. So I'm also going to try and see. So this is the map that the route that I took in my first journey in 2013. I think now it's impossible to kind of retrace this. I couldn't even do the same kind of mapping when I was traveling once I left this part of the world. And the reason it became difficult was that in most of these places, the map stopped working. Even these maps that track the movement kind of stopped working. And the image on the other side is the image that my sister drew up. She kind of mocked it in the Illustrator. She said that this would be the journey that I would take. But the green part of the journey is what I could take. But the blue line, which I was meant to take, never really materialized the same way because it was just impossible. So the traveling itself became very, very difficult. And now it's almost impossible to really think about this kind of a journey anymore. As I said, I don't think I could return and do that kind of a journey in India anymore. This book then is not a straightforward chronology of travel. Instead, it's a series of encounters in towns, cities, and abandoned ruins. The absence, the silence, and the ambiguity of some of the geographical locations are intended to protect the identities of those who appear in the book and the contested spaces they inhabit. Not all stories made their way into the book. When ambiguity could no longer protect people, I let their stories go. Not all stories need to be told. It's not my goal to bear witness or give voice to the voiceless. Such writings have long been implicated in the history of colonial ethnographic practices, where native informants post themselves to become the voice of the empire. I don't want to be the voice of the empire. The people in the book are eloquent advocates of their history and their struggles. My role then, and this book's role, is to find in its articulations a critique of the nation state, its violence, the arbitrariness of territorial sovereignty. Stories in this book are a way to engage with how people live, struggle, fight, and survive. Their stories challenge us to think, to consider whether it's possible to reject the idea that freedom, dignity, and self-determination require territorial sovereignty. The more I traveled along the border, the more I realized that the books I had read were disconnected from the realities of the people I encountered. Local history and memory sometimes bore no resemblance to the political history I knew. I had to unlearn how I wrote, but more importantly, I had to unlearn the prejudices of the privilege I had. Meanwhile, India I was writing about was rapidly transforming itself into a violent, xenophobic Hindu state, waging war against its constitution and so many of its people. An authoritarian India, deeply antagonistic to secularism, political dissent, and pluralism emerged as I traveled and wrote this book. In the northern state of Rajasthan, just after the Muslim folk singer Ahmad Khan was lynched in the Jaisalmer's Dantal village. So this was one of the first instances when, while I was traveling, there was an act. So by early 2015, stories of lynchings, especially of minority communities, of Muslims, Dalits, women who were considered witches, mostly those who were minorities or came from minority communities, the number of lynchings had started going up. And it became a news. It became news in a way that there were films made. There was a film that was made called The Republic of Lynching. And in general, people saw that a certain kind of violence had started happening. And in this case, I was in Rajasthan traveling and the lynching had just taken place. And this was a few kilometers away, but you could see how news traveled very quickly. And as a woman traveling alone, I was very quickly told to lock up my doors, that I had to be inside. Again, understand that I was not in the same town. I was easily a few kilometers away. And yet the idea that a single act of violence had created so much insecurity in these regions was very palpable. Khan hailed from the Manganiyar community of Muslims who are known for their folk songs in praise of Hindu deities. A Hindu priest, a local faith healer named Ramesh Sutar, hired Khan and then lynched him for not singing well enough. Over 40 Muslims fled the village following the lynching. These folk singers once traversed the undivided deserts of the region from Rajasthan to Sindh in present-day Pakistan, singing songs of Alexander the Great, old kings, conquest, local gods and goddesses, and beautiful singing girls. A few weeks later, I saw the footage of a Muslim dairy farmer, Pehlu Khan, begging for his life before a Hindu mob in Alwar, Rajasthan. Despite video evidence, the men who killed him were acquitted. Tabish, a young protester I met during the 2019 protests against the India citizenship laws, spoke about the fear most young Muslims live with. He says, "We are so used to this fear, we think it is normal." I saw people circulating videos of Junaid, the 16-year-old boy being lynched on the train. Junaid had been traveling back to his village in Haryana after shopping in Delhi for the Muslim festival of Eid in June 2017. Tabish was in his ancestral village in Meerut when the news broke. A week after, when he boarded the train from Meerut to Delhi, he traveled in fear. "I shaved my week-long stubble. I kept to myself the entire journey." While violence against minorities in India has always been chronic, By 1970s, winning elections by appealing to majoritarian sentiments against Muslims and marginalized communities had become a well-honed strategy. This culminated in 3 events that fundamentally transformed India: the pogroms against Sikh in Delhi in 1984, the destruction of Babri Masjid in 1992 in Ayodhya by the Hindu mob from Vishwa Hindu Parishad, a militant right-wing Hindu nationalist organization, and the slaughter of Muslims in Gujarat in 2002. Since Prime Minister Modi came to power in 2014, Muslims have been disproportionate victims of violence, especially lynchings. There were 47 cow-related hate crimes between May 2014 and April 2019. Since 2014, a rise in violence, threats, and intimidation against minorities in India and a failing economy with no opportunities have resulted in thousands fleeing the country. Many fly to Central America, where they begin their long, precarious journey northwards towards the US-Mexico border on the foot. So this is another part of the story I think that many forget, is that between 2017 and 2020, the number of those leaving India, fleeing and flying into Central America and making the journey towards the US-Mexico border actually grew enormously. From a few hundred people, the numbers actually grew to thousands by early 2019. The US immigration lawyers I spoke to confirmed the rise in number of Indian asylum seekers entering the country through the southern Mexico border since Prime Minister Modi came to power, and cite the increase in sectarian violence as one of the reasons, along with dwindling livelihood choices. I think all of you also remember the 6-year-old Indian girl named Gurpreet who died in the Arizona desert after her mother left her with other Indian immigrants to go in search of water. Hate speech by Modi and his ministers have been widespread and ongoing. And just as I was traveling and writing this book, I wondered if as a nation, we were forever condemned to return to the violent moment of our birth. When I was younger, I believed that India was somehow different, that despite our many failures, we were unique. I believed that we were secular and democratic. Here at the end of those 7 years, I no longer hold such beliefs, but I am moved by the radical hope that we should continue to fight for a new world, remade by these values. So one of the other things that happened after Modi comes to power, after the re-election in 2019, the government begins to aggressively implement its election promises to actually remake India into a Hindu nation. In the first 100 days, the Modi government unconstitutionally revoked the special status of Jammu and Kashmir, putting over 8 million Kashmiris under an unprecedented information blockade. The UAPA, the terror laws were amended to designate individuals as terrorists unilaterally, and the Right to Information Act was completely diluted. So along with violence, what you really see is the destruction of institutions, of laws, but also the ways in which laws that are meant to protect the citizens are being weaponized against them. One of the really remarkable things about the Indian Constitution, the fundamental rights, as imagined by Ambedkar, was that fundamental rights would always be interpreted in favor of the citizen and not the state. The citizen was always the most important unit, the entity, the person to be protected, never the state. Of course, Modi is not the one who starts this. This has been happening over a really long period of time. But the emergence of Modi, what you really see is that every law now is interpreted in favor of the government. When I say the government, specifically the Modi government, and every institution now is an arm of the authoritarian state. In some ways, by practice, what we've done is we've eroded institutional integrity that is fundamental to holding on and making sure that the citizens and their rights are protected. The other thing that happened was also the Caa and Nrc, and not to mention the Delhi violence that happens in February 2020 in response to this violence. Through my travels, I attempted to trace the outline of a country that is part modern, part feudal, and still struggling with democracy. By the end of my travels, I found myself not with one map of India, but many maps that looked far different from the one I thought I knew. I was taught to look at the fringes from the imaginary center, always looking outward from the mainland to a faraway frontier. But when I found myself at the frontier, I realized I was standing in a wholly different world, a wholly different history, and a wholly different version of a country I called home. And yet, in this landscape of unmarked graves and buried landmines and cries for freedom, I began to understand that we live in a world made of borderlands, that borders are being created everywhere. While the stories in the book are from Afghanistan-Pakistan border, from India's borders, they could take place anywhere. It is not just South Asian borders that are unraveling. Borders around the world are enclosing and suffocating their people rather than guaranteeing their freedom. What happened in Bosnia repeated in Rwanda. What happened in Palestine is now happening in Kashmir. And it's not just violence and war that people are fleeing. Climate change will radically remake the borders of the world. What lines will you enforce with a standing army when water and fire have swallowed them? What sovereignty will you impose on cities being erased by the racing seas? Edward Said wrote that the earth is in effect one world in which empty, uninhabited spaces virtually do not exist. Just as none of us are outside or beyond geography, none of us is completely free from the struggle over geography. The stories in this book are part of a greater universal struggle over geography as individuals across the world navigate the imposition of arbitrary borders. In the words of historian Romila Thapa, borders only become borders when cartographies come into existence. Today, we live in a world where commodities, capital, and drones have far more greater freedom of movement than people fleeing dictators or genocide. Borders we've established in many places cannot continue to exist as they are. We shape nations out of imaginary non-existent lines, sometimes amputating communities and whole cultures to make way for a country. And we defend these lines with violence, lest they cease to exist altogether. As the need to rethink the shape of the post-war, post-colonial world intensifies, the world contemplates the future of democracy, a nation state in contested terrains. The stories from borderlands need to be told. These real histories are intricate, contradictory, and full of inconvenient truths that cannot be neatly sorted into textbook categories of cause and effect. They hold immense pain, but they can also reveal a glimpse of a new world. I'll finish the reading at that. And the only other thing that I really wanted to share was this list. During the course of writing this list, we compiled a list of people in Assam. As NRC was unfolding, of course, this number is now much higher. So these are people who were called as doubtful citizens, picked up. And in the book, you would see their names in the middle, not in the index. And there's an entire category called death by citizenship. And it was important that we put these names in the middle of the book and think about what it means for us to even write about them, because even getting all of these names together was incredibly difficult. The number is much higher now. And another thing that I really wanted to share was also things that didn't make the book, or that really didn't make the book because we felt it was either difficult or we just didn't know if it made sense to carry this kind of violence in between the pages. What you see here is a scan from a local newspaper. This is from the 90s. This is from Kashmir, where these images became death telegrams because the number of young men who were picked up and killed were so many that this is how families got to know that their dear ones had passed away. And what is painful is that today the same thing is kind of repeating in Kashmir again. The last few days, the number of people who have been picked up and killed, the numbers have again gone up. In some ways, how does one talk about this kind of violence? Another thing about the book is also that the book has images. And I had to figure out ways to photograph people and what I was seeing without implicating them. That's another reason why the shadows, but also we don't want the act of documenting someone's life to also become the photograph that gets them into trouble. And finally, of other things that didn't make the book, are these kinds of what I really wanted this book to be, a scrapbook. And these are all things that happened as I was writing the book, whether it is the amount of money that was spent in the hearings, how in a jingoistic, nationalistic country where you're constantly told that one has to sacrifice their rights in order, it's okay for one to sacrifice their rights because the soldiers are on the border. Yeah, you have a Kargil war veteran who's been declared a foreigner. Again, you have sedition charges and FIRs being filed against poems, against the Mia poets. But another interesting thing that I really loved was also these stories. The Runaway Grandmother, who, again, the ways in which people consistently subvert what we think are these lines. Initially, what I wanted to do was also have these newspapers be a part of the book. But then my editor said, one of the things that my editor said was that, the book is already quite heavy, so you don't want to kind of put all of these things in. As I said, this book is a fraction of the many things that I encountered. And the way for me to think about this book now is also a conversation about what is the future. We know that the way we live right now cannot go on anymore. So how do we then reconstitute ourselves? And I think with that, I'll kind of bring this to an end. And I think I also did well with the time. So it's good.
Suchitra, there's a lot here to unpack. I've always wondered how a people's history can be truly a people's history. And I think you're doing a very good job of that. But I do have two sets of questions for you. You speak of freedom that is not territorially bounded. I mean, that was one of the points you made. How can individuals relate to home with a sense of belonging without some idea of territory? So I just wanted to ask you that. And the second issue relates to partition and your own journeying of the borderlands. And I wondered, given the sensitivity with which you're dealing with this issue, whether actually traversing the borderlands was such a great idea, or because it's the borders, because I mean, partition is the foundational myth of the post-colonial state of India and Pakistan as well, in Bangladesh. And it's not the borders, but the borders that we constantly create within that are the real problem. Because partition becomes the way in which we ferret out people who used to be living cheek by jowl, not perhaps in complete harmony, but they were related. And I wondered whether doing the borderlands that you now say is impossible to do, is whether the next iteration shouldn't really be the borders that we create within. So those are my two sets of questions for you.
The question about freedom, in most of the stories that you encounter in this book, people think of freedom in incredibly nuanced and sophisticated ways, in ways that talk more about community, about people that they hold dear. There's a really beautiful moment in the Afghanistan-Pakistan chapter where we are in Sharhausa, we are sitting, and here is someone who is a businessman who again has a history of violence. His father was a mujahid who gets killed. He has been a refugee and kind of returned back. And he says, I'm a businessman. And then, I don't fight other people's war anymore. My father and my grandfather and my father fought imperial wars. I no longer fight other people's war. And then he very quickly points to his friend and he says, you should ask him. He remembers everything. I only remember being hungry. And the setting of that conversation is important because the room is made up of men who the NATO forces are paying to fight against each other. And as you travel across the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, and true of many other stories in the book, is that people relate to each other through ideas of loyalty and community. How they fled together and became refugees together. You could have been in Sharhausa or then left to Peshawar, returned back. So what binds them is a shared history of exile. Similarly, if you look at the Punjab chapter, Sari Begum, who is a child, is a much older woman now, but is a child of rape between a young Muslim girl whose family then comes and rescues her, but leaves her as a child behind. for her, she says, the idea of the India-Pakistan doesn't make sense to me. And and the way she speaks is very lyrical, because it kind of goes back to Manto's idea of who do these children, because he has his line in his book about these children, children of rape that happen. He says, who do these children belong to, India, Pakistan? And she says something very similar, that who do I belong to? I don't belong to any of them. Who I do belong to are people who have been generous and considerate towards me. So even by the act of living, they've already broken this idea of nationalism. And whether you see in all of these communities, what nourishes them is not the idea of territorial sovereignty. What nourishes them is the idea of who keeps them safe, how their histories have been passed on to them. With Assam, one of the stories you see is this young woman who is because of a mistaken identity, is being dragged violently by the police as a doubtful voter. When I went to interview her, the entire village surrounds her, not only as an act of curiosity, but also as an act of community. They want to make sure that they are there because she's protected. For them, that sense of community is not connected to territorial sovereignty. It's connected to a sense of care. It's connected to a sense of how do we protect ourselves. What connects them is also the sense of bureaucratic neglect, because the state has already withdrawn from these spaces, because they say the last time someone was here, it was when the entire village was underwater and the local politician arrives for a photo opportunity and then leave. And this was almost 10 years ago. So these are also spaces where, while you can feel the violence of the state has also withdrawn in terms of everything else, welfare, services. So how do these people think of their community? They think of their community not as a nation state, not as territorial sovereignty. It's a community of care. In the chapters of Nellie massacre, you again see the same thing. What binds them is an act of surviving, an act of violence. Again, what binds them is an act of living, act of resistance, act of giving together. And none of these spaces was there a sense that either they didn't feel that they belonged to the Indian nation state, they didn't feel that the Indian nation state owed them anything, or that they owed a loyalty back. In some places, it also felt that they were already trying to define their own sense of freedom. So I don't think in any of these communities, and another thing that I couldn't actually put in the book, all of these communities made their own maps, maps that regularly militated against the Indian nation state. Of course, the most obvious ones are the Khalistani maps that kids would draw in the early 70s and 80s. But in all of these communities, they had their own version of the map, of their communities, of the homes, of their villages. They made their own maps, maps of their nation state, how they viewed themselves. The reason we couldn't put these maps in the book was because India has a law that says that the only map that could be reproduced in official books is the map as offered by, authorized by the Indian state. So we weren't sure if we could put these other maps, which were in some ways tinkering with the idea of the territorial sovereignty of this nation. So that
actually misspoke. I didn't mean territorial sovereignty so much as place and belonging. And I take your point that common suffering can give you a sense of belonging. But the speciality is still there. It's not territorial in the sense of the nation state, but I take your point. I think that I would agree with that.
Also, their sense of space is also more
relational.
It's a sense of community.
That's right.
It's a sense of openness. And one thing that comes over and over again is that we never imagined these borders. We never imagined that these borders would exist. Even those who were for a partition India did not imagine the kind of militarized borders. People imagined a frontier-like existence where someone from, this is a story that happens all the time in Paktika province, all of the women were from India. Either they were from the state of Uttar Pradesh or from Hyderabad in India. And there's a long history of women traveling across the subcontinent to this small little village in Afghanistan, because the men in these communities for generations had traversed across the subcontinent, all the way from Sharhausa to Uttar Pradesh, to Calcutta, all the way down to Hyderabad, up to Sindh. So this idea of a frontiered existence, the racial memory of a border doesn't exist. And almost all the older Afghans you speak to, the racial memory of a border is not Pakistan, is not India. It's an open frontiered idea. And I think there is a need to an oral history of imagining also how people imagine space. And I think we've also altered our ideas and imagining of space. And I think that is also, we also limit ourselves when we think of space as relational to a map, to a border, to a fence. And I think that's definitely another thing that kept coming up over and over again. The second thing about the borders is that I wouldn't do a book like this now. I started this book when I was 27, 28. And I thought that, and now at the end of all of this, now that I've done this book, this idea seems not so good anymore. And this is something that I've thought for myself, is that why would one replicate the lines that one already knows is so violent in terms of imagination, but also why travel the lines? And I also think that I had to do this in order for me to arrive at the conclusion that perhaps this is not the way that one thinks about this. And that's also a reason why the ocean frontiers are not in this book. It's only the land. And the more I think about the ocean frontiers, I realize that how does one do the ethnography of Indian Ocean? There's so many brilliant scholars, young scholars who are now emerging to think about it. But how does one then talk about that? I think I have a lot of work intellectually. I think a lot of way for me to go ahead also to think about it. But I think writing this book also taught me that perhaps there are other ways to think about the story. Perhaps there are other ways to write the story. While this is an introduction to a very specific, I was responding to a very specific time, and that time is now past, both intellectually, politically, but also in terms of what one can do in India today.
Well, I think we'd like to open it up to the audience. Are there questions? I see in the Q&A two questions, one from Priyanka and one from Wendy.
Sure. So Priyanka Anand has a question. So she's asking, in your interactions with the people along these borderlands, what were your observations about the individuals' changing perceptions of family and kinship, especially with people who may be on the other side of the border or who got separated decades prior?
I think one thing that definitely, I think everybody, I don't want to generalize because it's very different for many of these communities. The world changes every 100 feet here, so I don't want to make generalizations. I think one thing that people regularly talked about was how it's difficult for them to tell their stories without it becoming rambling and meandering. Ghazi, who appears in the Bangladesh borderlands chapter, in India-Bangla border, has a very interesting history. You know, he talks about growing up in a place where a very small fishing village, which was very porous. During his lifetime, he sees that being transformed. He talks about how his mother would just walk across the river and you would be on the other side where he could go see his aunt. He also talks about his grandmother, who, when she was born, it was British India. And, you know, she then has sons and daughters on both sides. When East Pakistan was there, now it's Bangladesh. And also one of his other grandparents, actually now 104 years old, leaves this part of the world and then travels to Assam, where, you know, he goes there as a migrant laborer looking for work. There are other histories of migration where they talk about families traveling for hundreds of kilometers to go see a prophet, a local community preacher who they think is a prophet who would give them solutions for what's happening. So one thing you see regularly is that people's sense of family and community is always wild and rambling, and a sense of genealogy and history is passed on. And they see how these borders can become violent. The story of Ali in the book is also same, where his wife, it was very common for women to travel from what is now Bangladesh, all the way from what is a village in Bangladesh across the subcontinent to other communities in Gujarat to get married. And you see how even these porous borders kind of become militarized. So they see this more as a way in which their life, their family, and their communities are consistently being destroyed. But also, even as they try to fight the state, this hasn't stopped people from crossing the border. Ghazi says, when did it become illegal for me to know? I remember being in my mother's hip and just crossing the river to see my aunt. When did that become, illegal? So yes, I think, I don't think people see this as the other side of the border. I think people see this as a constant siege against their history, their families, and their communities.
Thank you. Then we have, it's a comment from Wendy, but I'm hoping you can respond to it the same as well. Along the lines of defining home and displacement during the COVID pandemic, a lot of South Asian male sailors have been stranded on ships due to the defaults of the ship owners. Perhaps in the future of a possible climate apocalypse, more and more laboring people, such as those asylum seekers from India and those stranded on ships with unpaid wages, will be on such territories of exploitation, alive but without dignity.
This is not new. Borders make unequal people. Borders have always made unequal people, and this is not new. There's another thing that I'm researching for another project where you see these young Muslims, sailors from in around 1880s jump ship and land in Louisiana because this is not the way that they wanted to. The empire builds not only a racial hierarchy, but it also creates lines. Even today, as a migrant to this country, it took me years to even get the right to work and write. And why? Why is it that? Because borders make unequal people, and this sense of exploitation is not new. And I think there's a long history of, the subcontinent also has a long history of indentured labor. Gaitura Bahadur's book, Coolie Woman, does an incredible job of tracing her great-grandmother's journey as an indentured labor from leaving India, going to Guyana, and how do we kind of unravel those histories. So the sailors stranded in COVID is not an exception, it is the rule.
If I may be allowed to ask one additional question, please raise your hands if you don't want to write your question. But I was a bit puzzled by one statement or a couple that you made about Ambedkar's revolutionary constitution. Were you being skeptical, or I'm sarcastic, or are you actually, you really think that it was a revolutionary? It was basically the Government of India Act of 1935. So, I was wondering whether you were being sarcastic or what. I misheard you. Could you clarify that, please?
No, because if you read, and I think I was being a bit tongue-in-cheek.
Yes.
Because if you listen to, I did the great mistake of listening to Indian constitutional lawyers, and also a lot of them are men of a certain of class and caste, and they, for them, the Ambedkar's constitution is a revolutionary constitution, and even the constitutional debates are seen as the idea that somehow, I think it's for me also, I think it was that's why I say in the book that I also had to unlearn the prejudices of my privilege. When I say that, it's not just about understanding my own positionalities in the spectrum, but also realizing that when I grew up in India, as a young person in the 90s, the idea that somehow India was better was just accepted. The fact that India could produce a constitution and then Pakistan did not, everything was always in relationship to Pakistan, not so much in relationship to Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. Something that you consistently heard was that we were better because we produced a secular constitution. We were better because a towering figure like Ambedkar could be the head of the Constituent Assembly. So in some ways, it's not very different from saying Obama becomes a president, we live in a post-racial world. Yes, this is not to take away from what that moment meant to so many African Americans and others. It was an important moment. In 2008, I know friends of mine who, came to DC and they were crying, and it was an important moment. But we also know the hubris that the presidency left behind. So how does one then think about the Indian Constitution without not disrespecting, but I think one has to really be, really understand that we also have to unlearn our indoctrination about what we think is the Constitution. And I think Jan Prakash's book about the emergency makes a very interesting point. It says that India's emergency, or the fascism that we see raising, the emerging fascism, the institutional degradations, are not an exception, but already founded in the founding document.
Of course.
That the powerful executive, all of this is not an exception, it's already foundational in this. So the idea of, this is something that Dolly Kikon does as well, she says that this is not an emancipatory constitution, this is not a revolutionary constitution, this is that's why I very quickly say this. So this revolutionary constitution in some ways is tongue-in-cheek in that it is not revolutionary. It could have been, and yet it's the same document that then gets used to, again, my grandfather was independent India's first political prisoner. He becomes a political prisoner, not because he's charged with sedition for organizing the labor movements for unionizing the workers. India's first amendment is also an amendment that directly goes towards the heart of the fundamental rights. So in 1948, you're already charging the very people who were foundational or important to whatever freedom that you thought, and you're already arresting them because they were organizing workers for better life. So I think, yes, it was, and it's, again, as I said, it's very common among Indian constitutional experts and lawyers to think of the Ambedkarite constitution as a revolutionary constitution, but Ambedkar does not give us an Ambedkarite constitution. He has to make compromises.
That's right.
And yeah, that's.
Well, thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that. There's one hand up. I think Shugata Bose has a question.
Yes, he does. I'm just gonna allow him to talk. Dr. Bose.
Oh, hello. Yes. First of all, Suchitra, congratulations on the book. And I'm delighted that it has been published in India as well, because just as news organizations have wilted, so also many publishing houses have been successfully intimidated in India. And the legal teams associated with these publishers seem to want to portray truthful writing as an unlawful activity. So under those circumstances, to have a book of the sort that you've written come out is an achievement in itself. Second, I think that you did the right thing by beginning to write from the borders inwards. You must have noted that recently the Border Security Forces remit has been expanded. So gradually, there is this creeping sort of movement to turn the whole of the landmass of India into a borderland. The state governments of Bengal and Punjab, where there are opposition parties in power, have of course protested, because if you actually give the BSF free run 50 miles from the border, that is a huge chunk of the territory of these border states. So I wondered whether you would reflect on that. And finally, a third, I just wanted you to speak as a lawyer. You've just talked about the Constitution, and there used to be actually a critical scholarship on the Constitution in the early years of independence. Then came a moment when there were just celebratory accounts. And finally, again, now I think there is new critical scholarship on the so-called founding moment of the Republic. And while the anti-CAA protests were going on, I wrote a short article in the Indian Express, talking about those who had questioned the emergency provisions that were put into the Constitution. Men like Harivishnu Kamath thought that these emergency provisions were like
Sorry, Suchitra, you're breaking up. Didn't hear you.
And so forth. Now, the real challenge that we face today is that, we live in a country of what Gandhi would have called lawless laws. And to protest those lawless laws, of course, you can resort in Gandhian fashion to non-cooperation or civil disobedience of unjust laws. But I'd like you to just tell us whether, one can, in fact, as a lawyer, how does one combat lawlessness while remaining within some kind of a legal constitutional framework?
Right. I've made extensive notes, so I'm going to try and answer all of them. I actually want to start by thanking my editors at India. I think they're one of the last editors who actually publish the kind of book. It's very difficult to, the US publishers were great, but also in US, there's no fear of a book being banned. Like they don't ban books in the US anymore. But the India publishers, I think I was very lucky with, again, run under the leadership of two remarkable women who have continued to publish subversive books, is they championed this book. And the promise that they made to me is that they would champion this book and they would let me write this book the way that I wanted to write it. And for a first-time writer who really doesn't come from any kind of political, literary, or the kind of Delhi elitist power that one often sees, because most of India's English language writers still come from a certain kind of political power. Again, I said political, literary, and cultural power. I don't have that. For them to champion this book was very important. For example, in the book, in the Indian version of the book, I very clearly say that I told my editor that, look, I'm not going to call it as Indian administered Kashmir. Their first response was, yes, because things have become so bad that how can we not publish a book when things are this way? Almost, when I heard that, I was very surprised. So the Indian book does have the word Indian administered Kashmir. Almost, it's an act of, for me, that's an act of great courage. And I wrote this book. They never once asked me to remove anything from this book. Even when the legal edit came back, the only thing that we did was we had more citations. The India book has far more citations. Every sentence has 2 or 3 citations, but they never once asked me to remove a single thing, which, taken everything together, I think the credit truly goes to my editor. Now, the question of the protest, no, I'll take the question about the country becoming the borderland. This is not very different from the ICE playbook, because if you see how ICE defines homeland security, they also have a very arbitrary line, which is, I think, a few 100 miles into. So that's how ICE defines its homeland security. And they have been trying to push the boundary, which means that the border now no longer stops at this border. The border now extends into the heart of the homeland is also the borderland. And it's an ICE playbook. It's also the playbook that the Israelis have taken in a very different way with the settlements. So again, one thing you realize is that the authoritarian regimes tend to talk to each other and learn from each other very quickly. And the same thing is happening with India as well. We also know that the amount of money that intelligence agencies, various intelligence agencies, military intelligence, the military, the BSF, the CRPF, the amount of money that they have as discretionary funds is unimaginable. So I think that is, for me, that is not new, but I think it is something that you take from the playbooks that have already been implemented. There is a reason why ICE can knock down the door of someone in Harlem or in Bronx and demand that they get in without a warrant. So that is all creating these borders and borderlands within. So that is already here. We're already creating these many borders, borderlands, not just at the frontier. The border doesn't begin and end at the frontier anymore. It is everywhere. And borders can also now take multiple forms. So I don't see this as, I just see this as all of these regimes kind of learning from each other, because they also do joint exercises now. Israel and India now have a very close joint relationship. So does the United States. They all learn from each other. So that has always existed. Now the question of the Constitution. I think in 2016, there was a poll, 2015, there was a poll that put the Indian Supreme Court as the most respected institution in India, followed by the Indian military. It's very interesting if you think about it, you know. But I think the Indian Supreme Court's decline, or the shift from interpreting the Constitution in favor of the citizen to interpreting it in almost not interpreting it at all, has been going on for a really long time. For instance, the petition against demonetization is still in the court. The petitions against Kashmir is still in the court. Again, 5 years of demonetization, the Supreme Court hasn't ruled. But what is really egregious is that with the Ayodhya and the Babri Masjid judgment, the Supreme Court justices didn't even put their names in it. And I think for long, you know, there's an analogy that a friend said, is that it's the Supreme Court of India is like a pressure cooker. Every few years, they will do a marginally decent judgment, and it feels like the pressure is left off. And then they go back to the status quo. The problem is not that the Supreme Court is interpreting the Constitution wrongly, it's just that they've just stopped interpreting the Constitution. We have BK 16 political prisoners, 16 political prisoners, Dr. Anand Teltumde, Sudha Bharadwaj, Rona Wilson, Shoma Sen, all being held for almost 3 years now. Now, yes, there is more critical scholarship emerging, and I am grateful for it. But at the heart of all of this critical scholarship, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is still the belief that I, as a child, had, was that we are somehow better. That constitutional morality that somehow the Indian Constitution embodies is always going to save us. And I think that maybe it's false promise of hope. Maybe it's the belief that Constitution can save us. I think are fundamental, I think, to the way in which constitutional scholars continue to view India. And I think that is the problem, that we are no longer willing, we are not willing to name the beast. We are not willing to accept the fact that the constitutional morality hasn't been moral or ethical for a really long time. And in terms of the protests, I don't think it's possible to do anything within the legal means in India anymore. Not because I'm a pessimist, because we do not know what is legal or not legal anymore. For instance, you had, let me take the most popular case. Shah Rukh Khan's son was picked up. And I bring up Shah Rukh Khan and not just the political prisoners because, it's interesting because here is a young man who was not in the possession of drugs. There was no proof that he had the drugs. And yet, what would have been a very simple matter, this is not a great constitutional crisis. You're not finding cure for cancer. You're not sending a rocket ship up the space. It's a very straightforward bail procedure. Krishna Iyer almost 30 years ago said, it's bail, not jail. And yet the spectacle plays out. And the reason I bring this case is not because that this is an exception. This case happened because you've held people like Anand Teltumde and Shudha Bharadwaj and lawyers under terror laws, either without charges, without evidence, without fabricated choices, on fabricated choices. So the law has stopped functioning a very long time ago because we do not know what is illegal, because what is legal is already disappeared. So I think what India needs, and I think that's what Shaheen Bagh is so important, is a civil disobedience movement, which would actually challenge the institutions, the government, the state itself. Because without that kind of civil disobedience, we are still going to be stuck in a place where we are constantly trying to figure out where the boundaries are. There are no boundaries. All legal safeguards have been taken. Anybody could be picked up, anybody could be detained. Journalist Siddiq Kappan has been incarcerated for over 2 years, almost over a year now. And the FIR lists 36 of his articles and says, we are charging him with sedition for reporting on these things. If you look at the 36 articles that have been listed in the FIR, the police do not claim that this report is wrong. They do not say this is fake news. They do not say this is fabricated. Instead, they simply say, by reporting on marginalized communities, on reporting on Islamophobia, on reporting on violence, Siddiq Kappan has committed a crime. So in any other secular democracy, this would be a joke. And yet Kappan has remained behind bars for almost a year. So given all of this, I don't think there is a law because law has disappeared. And protest now should be a civil disobedience. And I think that is the future. Now, the question is, are we in a place where a civil disobedience is possible? On a hopeful day, I feel yes. On a very sad, depressed day, I feel maybe, I don't know. So I think I've answered almost all of the comments that you raised.
There are two more questions,
Okay.
but we have run out of time. So it's really up to you.
Okay.
We've already sort of kept you for long enough. But there's one from Meena Dhanda, who's asking whether there was, from a comparative perspective, about the casticized aspects of lives in the borderland, and whether you think that in some regions there's more caste-infused life than in others.
Let me just look at the question. No, I think all of India, caste is fundamental to everything we do. Often the people the farthest away from power are also people who belong to certain communities that have been constantly marginalized. Who were the Muslims who were lynched? These were landless, poor Muslims. Many of them were Dalits, many of them. So caste is integral to not only bureaucratic violence, but also who gets to tell the story. I think that if you think about the histories of partition, I think even if you go, for example, when I was in the Amritsar Partition Museum, it was very surprising to me that the stories that were recounted or remembered, the material objects all belonged to those who could write in English. You know, there were refugee cards in which people could write English. People had their trunks, people had their ancestors' uniforms, photographs, but one forgets that even access to these material objects itself is a function of access to caste privileges. Many people who fled, who did not come from class or caste privileges, did not have material objects that they could carry with them, that they could be remembered. Their memories of the partition is very different. And I think those memories have not even been memorialized in a way that we can think of. Also, when I was traveling towards the end, people started asking very simple, very specific questions, because I usually travel like this. So, you know, I have my hair pulled back, I wear full hand clothing, nothing the way I look. There's no religious markers when you look at me. And people would start asking questions like, are you a Brahmin? And then, while I'm not a Brahmin, in certain parts when I was traveling, I had to lie that I was a Brahmin because otherwise it became very tense. In other places, people would ask things like, are you a Muslim? People were very specific in terms of they wanted to place me within a hierarchy so they could decide what to do with me. And placing me within a hierarchy also helped them understand what power I had. So yes, caste appears both within the way we tell the stories, who gets to tell the stories, and also how violence gets reproduced consistently. So I think that, yeah, definitely caste is something that is, it's impossible to write about South Asia without thinking about caste, without how it infects every aspect of our life.
And again, Suchitra, I'm not going to ask you to answer any more questions unless you wish to. And so Nina is thanking you, but Satgan has thrown in a question at the last minute, and there's one from Dina.
I can see Satgan's. Hey, Satgan, so it's nice to see you. Actually, I can't see you, but thank you for the question and thanks for coming in. We were supposed to get coffee in New York when she was here, but I couldn't. So I'm very sorry. And hopefully next time you're here, we will. I think the policies in India today have emboldened. I think India is going to be a big concern. But also, I think the United States has a long history of having inconvenient relationships with authoritarian regimes. I think they have it as a playbook. I think what one would have to reconsider is whether this idea that somehow, it's very interesting when you speak to people in DC, they still think of India as the secular democratic nation that will be the bulwark against China. Surprisingly, that language is now beginning to change. For example, recently Kamala Harris talks about, for our shared values of democracy to exist, when Narendra Modi was here. There are concerns, but I really don't think, I think we do live in a world where strategic value and concerns are more important than people. We can speak about democratic values, but also United States has a long history and an excellent playbook of how they have perfected how to engage with authoritarian regimes. Now, increasingly authoritarian regimes are going to look like Turkey and India and Israel, but they already have the playbook for it. So I tend to be a little bit more, I'm a pessimist when it comes to that. I think we're done, right?
Yes, we are done, but there's this final question by Bina.
Okay.
Which is just read the last sentence. Is there still a chance that this democratic political process will prevail? I mean, Pakistanis liberals have for long looked at India as an answer to their own miseries with authoritarianism. And so she's asking whether there's any chance of this being restored.
I think Pakistanis also know the answer.
I certainly do, but I mean, Bina, I don't know what Bina's asking.
The answer actually is in the last chapter of the book, is also the book where my friend Natasha talks to me. I could never get to Pakistan because I never got the Pakistani visa to do it, to actually go to Pakistan, write this book. And something that Natasha says is that she says, as Pakistanis, we know what it means not to have a constitution. We had nothing, so we had to throw our bodies in line. And nobody should live through an authoritarian regime. And we know it. And every time we see Indians talk about it and destroying everything, she talks about how it breaks her heart. But she's also a Kashmiri from Amritsar who's not been able to go back. I think that India of my childhood, the India of many of your many of you know and perhaps came to love, is no longer there. India is a Hindu Rashtra now. So I don't think that the democratic political process will survive. I think India has another 20, 30 years of a very painful, it's going to be very painful the next 20, 30 years. Now, the question is what resistance will emerge and what will be left of it. Definitely not the secular democratic India that that I was born into. Not perfect, but still on paper, secular democratic. I don't think that India will exist. So I'm not being pessimistic, and I do think that process institutions are gone. But what I am hopeful about is the resistance. I think the moment we give up is when I feel everything is done. But no, I don't think India as the secular democratic polity will exist. I don't even think it'll exist in my lifetime, but it's going to be a very difficult 20, 30 years. And what we now need to think about is resistance, because a violent authoritarian state is also going to cause immense pain and damage to its people. I'm not talking about the vast majority. I'm not talking about the small elite who will continue to survive in their little bubbles. I'm really talking about the others. We've already seen it happening in Kashmir. We see it happening with the BK16 political prisoners will swell. It's already 17 this week. When it started was BK11, it became BK16, now it's BK17. They've just encountered 26 people. 26 people have been encountered because they were Maoist. There's another encounter. Every day brings news of more death. But no, I don't think India's democratic process will prevail. It breaks my heart, but I don't think it will prevail.
Well, on that very pessimistic note, Suchitra, but some hope of resistance, no less. Thank you for an excellent talk, and all the best for the sales of the book. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you so much for hosting me. Thank you for the questions. And also thank you, Fiza, for putting all of this together. I really appreciate it. And everybody who came. I know for Professor Danda, it's really late. For many of you, I know it's very late. So thank you so much. I really appreciate that you made the time to.
Well, thank you for making the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.